The year was 1941, and the Eastern Front was ablaze. German panzers rolled across the frozen steppes like steel thunder, crushing everything in their path. Soviet airfields lay in ruins, their hangars smoking graveyards of twisted metal. In the Kremlin, Stalin's generals stared at maps painted red with defeat, counting losses that mounted by the hour. Pilots were dying faster than they could be trained. Aircraft were falling from the sky like autumn leaves dot in this darkest hour, when conventional wisdom demanded conventional solutions. One woman dared to imagine the impossible. Marina Raskova, already a legend in Soviet aviation, stood before the highest echelons of military command with a proposal that would have been laughable in any other circumstance. As German bombers rained death on Moscow and Leningrad, as the Wehrmacht pushed deeper into the heart of the motherland, Raskova spoke words that would echo through history. "Give me your daughters." The room fell silent. These were hardened men who had survived Stalin's purges, who had witnessed the mechanized horror of modern warfare. Yet here was a woman suggesting that young girls could somehow turn the tide of a war that was devouring the world's most powerful armies. The skepticism was palpable, thick as the smoke that choked the burning cities. Women in combat? Flying military aircraft against the Luftwaffe? It was madness, but madness, in those desperate days, was perhaps the only sanity left. The Soviet Union was bleeding pilots and planes at an unsustainable rate. Traditional recruitment had been exhausted. The aviation schools could barely keep pace with the carnage. If the motherland was to survive, every resource would have to be mobilized, including half the population that had never been considered for combat roles. Raskova had already proven herself as one of the Soviet Union's most accomplished aviators. Her record-breaking flights had made her a national hero, a symbol of Soviet achievement in a world increasingly dominated by machines and speed. She understood aircraft not as abstract concepts, but as living extensions of human will. When she looked at the burning skies above Moscow, she didn't see defeat, she saw opportunity. The young women who would answer her call came from every corner of the vast Soviet empire. They were students at Moscow University, their textbooks abandoned for flight manuals. They were athletes who had traded swimming pools for cockpits. They were farm girls from the Ukraine, their hands calloused from grain harvests, now learning to grip control sticks. They were factory workers from Leningrad, accustomed to the rhythm of machinery, now discovering the heartbeat of aircraft engines. What united them was not experience. Most had never seen combat, but something far more powerful. The burning conviction that their homeland would not fall while they still drew breath. They had watched their brothers march off to war. They had seen their cities bombed, their families scattered. Now, finally, they would have their chance to strike back. The transformation from civilian to warrior began in training camps. That tested every limit of human endurance. These women faced conditions that would have broken seasoned soldiers. Dawn came early on the airfields, bringing bitter cold that penetrated leather jackets and froze moisture in their lungs. The instructors were male pilots, many of whom made no secret of their doubts about training women for combat. Some were openly hostile, believing that precious time and resources were being wasted on an impossible experiment. The aircraft they learned to fly were museum pieces, Polikarpov, Po-2 biplanes that had first taken to the air in the 1920s. These machines were antiques of wood and canvas, designed for crop dusting and training novice pilots, not for war. They had open cockpits that offered no protection from the elements. Their maximum speed barely exceeded that of a modern automobile. They carried no defensive armaments, no sophisticated navigation equipment, no radio communications. In an age of sleek fighters and powerful bombers, the Po-2 seemed like a relic from aviation's primitive past. German pilots, when they first encountered intelligence reports about Soviet women flying these obsolete biplanes, erupted in laughter. The Luftwaffe was equipped with some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Messerschmitt fighters that could outfly anything in the sky. Junkers bombers that carried devastating payloads across vast distances. The idea that canvas and wood biplanes piloted by inexperienced women could pose any threat to the German war machine seemed beyond absurd. Yet those who understood the mathematics of warfare began to see a different equation. The Po-2's very limitations might become strengths in the right circumstances. Its slow speed made it nearly impossible for fast German fighters to engage effectively. They would overshoot their targets and struggle to match the biplane's tight turning radius. Its minimal metal construction meant it barely registered on radar systems designed to detect larger aircraft. Most importantly, its near-silent gliding capability could make it invisible to the human ear until the moment of attack. But these theoretical advantages meant nothing without pilots capable of exploiting them. The women who would become the 588th Night Bomber Regiment faced training that pushed them beyond every conception of their limitations. They learned to fly in weather that grounded other aircraft, through ice storms that turned control surfaces rigid, through fog so thick that visibility dropped to mere meters. They practiced night flying until they could navigate by starlight alone, reading the landscape below through subtle variations in darkness. The psychological preparation was perhaps even more brutal than the physical training. These women had to overcome not just their own fears and inexperience, but the crushing weight of expectation and skepticism that surrounded them. Every mistake was magnified, every failure used as evidence that the entire program was folly. They faced ridicule from male pilots who saw their presence as a distraction or insult. They endured lectures from commanders who spoke to them as if they were children playing at war. Through it all, they developed bonds that would prove stronger than steel. In the frozen barracks where they huddled for warmth, sharing stories of home and dreams of victory, they forged an identity that transcended their individual backgrounds. They were no longer students or farmers or factory workers. They were pilots, warriors of the Soviet Union, sisters in arms who would trust each other with their lives in the darkness above enemy lines. The first combat missions revealed the gap between training and reality with brutal clarity. Nothing could have prepared them for the sensory assault of actual warfare. The searchlights that swept the sky like luminous fingers of death. The anti-aircraft fire that erupted in deadly flowers of light and shrapnel. The knowledge that below them lay thousands of enemy soldiers, whose sole purpose was to bring them down in flames. Their early sorties were exercises in controlled terror. Navigating by unreliable maps and dead reckoning, they fumbled through darkness that seemed to swallow their tiny aircraft whole. Some lost their way entirely, flying far from their targets and dropping their bombs on empty fields. Others were caught in searchlight beams and subjected to withering ground fire that shredded canvas and splintered wood. A few never returned at all, their aircraft vanishing into the night without explanation or trace. Yet with each mission, they learned. They discovered that fear could be managed, transformed from a paralyzing force into a heightened awareness that sharpened every sense. They mastered the art of flying without lights, using only the faint glow of instruments and the natural luminescence of snow-covered ground to maintain orientation. They developed techniques for approaching targets that minimized their exposure to defensive fire while maximizing the accuracy of their bombing runs. Most crucially, they learned to exploit the unique capabilities of their ancient aircraft. The Po-2's ability to fly at extremely low speeds allowed for precision attacks that larger, faster bombers could never achieve. Its minimal engine noise, especially when gliding with the motor cut, made it nearly impossible to detect until the moment of attack. The psychological impact of these silent approaches would soon become their most devastating. Weaponed out by late 1942, German soldiers along the Eastern Front had begun to whisper stories that chilled the heart. They spoke of ghostly aircraft that appeared without warning in the dead of night, delivering death with surgical precision before vanishing back into the darkness. The attacks came with such regularity and stealth that German troops began to dread the hours after midnight, when the moon was dark and the wind carried only the faint rustle of canvas against the night sky. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Germans gave these mysterious attackers a name that would echo through military history: Nachtwachen, the Night Witches. The moniker was born of frustration and fear, an attempt to diminish through mockery what could not be defeated through conventional means. German soldiers told each other that only supernatural forces could explain aircraft that appeared from nowhere, dropped their bombs with uncanny accuracy, and disappeared before defensive measures could be brought to bear. The reality was far more extraordinary than any supernatural explanation. The Night Witches had perfected a form of aerial warfare that combined ancient stealth with modern precision. Their approach was methodical and terrifying. They would fly to within a few kilometers of their target, then cut their engines and glide silently toward the objective. The only sound was the whisper of wind through rigging wires and canvas, a sound so soft that German sentries often dismissed it as natural wind until the bombs began to fall. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical damage. German soldiers, already stressed by the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, found their sleep constantly interrupted by the threat of silent death from above. The attacks came at irregular intervals, making it impossible to predict when or where the Night Witches might strike. Supply convoys began to move only during daylight hours. Artillery positions were constantly relocated. Command posts were dug deeper and camouflaged more carefully. The German High Command, initially dismissive of the threat posed by obsolete biplanes, was forced to acknowledge the growing impact of these nocturnal raids. They offered Iron Cross decorations to any pilot who could shoot down a Night Witch, a bounty that proved nearly impossible to collect. The fast German fighters were ill-equipped to engage such slow-moving targets in darkness. The Po-2's low speed and tight turning radius allowed it to outmaneuver pursuit aircraft that would stall and crash. Attempting to match such extreme flight characteristics, each night brought new challenges and new terrors for the women who flew these missions. The open cockpits of their aircraft offered no protection from the sub-zero temperatures at altitude. Ice formed on their goggles, forcing them to navigate by touch and instinct. The weight of their flight gear, heavy with ammunition and bombs, made even simple maneuvers exhausting. Frostbite was a constant companion, blackening fingers and faces that remained exposed to the brutal wind. Yet they flew night after night, mission after mission, with a dedication that bordered on the fanatical. Some pilots completed 8 or even 10 sorties in a single night, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before taking off again into the darkness. They pushed their aircraft and themselves to the absolute limits of endurance, driven by a combination of patriotic fervor and professional pride that made retreat or rest seem like betrayal. The personal cost was enormous. Many of the young women who had entered training full of excitement and idealism found themselves changed beyond recognition by the constant proximity to death. They watched friends disappear into the night, never to return. They saw aircraft explode in midair, taking their pilots to fiery graves thousands of feet above enemy territory. They learned to compartmentalize grief, to mourn quickly and move on, because the next mission was always waiting. Letters home, when they could be written, revealed the emotional toll of their service. These women, many still teenagers, wrote of homesickness and fear, of dreams postponed and innocence lost. Yet they also wrote of pride in their service, in their ability to strike back at the invaders who had brought such suffering to their homeland. They had found purpose in the darkness, meaning in the midst of mechanized horror, the tactical evolution of the night witches paralleled their emotional transformation. Early missions had been crude affairs, with bombs dropped almost randomly in the vicinity of enemy positions. But as their experience grew, so did their precision. They learned to read the landscape below with uncanny accuracy, identifying targets by the subtlest variations in light and shadow. They developed techniques for coordinating multiple aircraft in the same target area, maximizing damage while minimizing the risk of collision or friendly fire. Their intelligence network became increasingly sophisticated. Ground forces began providing detailed information about enemy positions, movements, and vulnerabilities. The night witches learned to time their attacks to coincide with other military operations, creating coordinated assaults that multiplied the psychological impact of their raids. They began carrying specialized ordnance, incendiary bombs for fuel depots, anti-personnel devices for troop concentrations, delayed action explosives for supply lines. The German response grew increasingly desperate. Searchlight batteries were reinforced and repositioned to create overlapping fields of illumination. Anti-aircraft guns were modified with specialized ammunition designed to engage low-flying targets. Night fighter patrols were increased, despite their general ineffectiveness against the elusive biplanes. Some German units resorted to firing flares continuously throughout the night, hoping to eliminate the cover of darkness that made the night witches so deadly. None of these countermeasures proved particularly effective. The night witches adapted to each new defensive tactic, developing techniques that turned German innovations against themselves. Searchlights became navigation aids, helping the pilots identify their targets from greater distances. Anti-aircraft fire revealed the precise locations of German positions, making them easier to attack on subsequent nights. The constant defensive measures exhausted German troops, reducing their effectiveness in conventional combat operations. By 1943, the night witches have become a strategic asset of immense value to the Soviet war effort. Their ability to disrupt German supply lines, communications, and troop movements had effects far beyond the physical damage they inflicted. German units along the front found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never certain when the next silent attack might come. Morale plummeted as soldiers realized that even the rear areas, previously considered safe, were now hunting grounds for these invisible predators. The major campaigns of the war's middle years showcased the full potential of the night witches' unique capabilities. During the Battle of the Caucasus, they flew missions that targeted German mountain positions previously thought to be invulnerable to air attack. The Po-2's ability to operate from improvised airstrips allowed the night witches to maintain pressure on German forces, even as conventional air bases were overrun or abandoned. In the Crimean campaign, they proved their worth as close air support, working in coordination with ground forces to eliminate German strongpoints and observation posts. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain, combined with their ability to deliver precision strikes, made them invaluable assets in the complex urban warfare that characterized much of the peninsula fighting. German commanders found their defensive positions constantly under attack from aircraft that seemed to know every street and building. The liberation of Belarus demonstrated the night witches' evolution into a mature military force. No longer the inexperienced volunteers who had fumbled through their first combat missions. They had become seasoned warriors capable of independent operations deep behind enemy lines. They coordinated with partisan forces, supplying guerrilla fighters and targeting German units attempting to suppress resistance activities. Their psychological impact was so profound that German troops began to abandon positions at the first sign of partisan activity, fearing that night witch attacks would inevitably follow. Throughout these campaigns, the individual stories of courage and sacrifice multiplied. There was Nadezhda Popova, who flew 852 combat missions and became one of the most decorated pilots in Soviet history. There was Yekaterina Budanova, who died when her aircraft was shot down during a daylight reconnaissance mission, one of the few times the Night Witches operated in full daylight. There was Lydia Litviak, the White Rose of Stalingrad, who combined service with the Night Witches with day fighter operations, becoming one of the world's first female fighter aces. Each of these women, and hundreds of others whose names are less well known, contributed to a legend that grew with every passing night. They had taken the mockery of their enemies and transformed it into a badge of honor. The Night Witches became a symbol not just of Soviet resistance, but of the unlimited potential that could be unleashed when desperate circumstances demanded revolutionary solutions. Yet the human cost continued to mount. The constant stress of night combat operations, combined with the primitive conditions under which they lived and worked, took an inevitable toll. Many pilots developed chronic health problems from prolonged exposure to cold and altitude. Others suffered psychological trauma that would haunt them long after the war's end. The casualty rate, while lower than that of day fighter squadrons, was still significant enough to require constant replacement and retraining of personnel. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The bonds forged between the surviving members of the regiment became more precious as their numbers dwindled. These women had shared experiences that no one else could truly understand. The terror of gliding silently over enemy territory, the satisfaction of seeing their bombs find their targets, the grief of losing friends to the darkness. They developed their own traditions, their own rituals for honoring the dead and celebrating the living dot as 1944 dawned, and the tide of war began to turn decisively in favor of the Soviet Union. The Night Witches found their role evolving once again. No longer were they primarily engaged in harassment raids against static defensive positions. Instead, they became hunters of retreating German columns, striking at supply convoys and troop movements as the Wehrmacht began its long withdrawal westward. These pursuit operations required different skills and tactics. The German army in retreat was a more mobile and unpredictable target than the entrenched positions they had previously attacked. The Night Witches had to learn to coordinate with rapidly advancing Soviet ground forces, providing close air support for units that might be dozens of kilometers from their last known position. They became masters of improvised logistics, operating from airfields that were little more than cleared fields, refueling from drums of aviation gasoline transported by truck, and maintaining their aircraft with tools and spare parts salvaged from destroyed German equipment. The final year of the war brought both triumph and melancholy. The Night Witches continued to fly combat missions even as Allied armies closed in on Berlin from the west and Soviet forces approached from the east. Their targets became increasingly desperate German attempts to maintain defensive lines, ammunition dumps, communication centers, and the remnants of the once mighty Luftwaffe. Each successful mission brought the end of the war closer, yet also marked the approaching end of their unique role in history. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, the Night Witches had compiled a record that defied every preconception about women in combat. They had flown more than 23,000 combat sorties, dropping thousands of tons of bombs on German positions across the Eastern Front. They had disrupted supply lines, destroyed equipment, and inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers or the resources invested in their training and equipment. More importantly, they had proven that courage, determination, and innovative thinking could overcome seemingly insurmountable disadvantages. Their obsolete aircraft had become precision weapons through the skill and dedication of their pilots. Their lack of formal military background had been transformed into tactical flexibility that confounded conventional military doctrine. Their status as women in a male-dominated profession had evolved from liability to asset, as they brought perspectives and approaches that their male counterparts could never have imagined. Yet, as the victory celebrations began and the Soviet Union started the long process of recovery from the devastation of war, the Night Witches found themselves facing a different kind of challenge. The very qualities that had made them so effective in combat, their independence, their unconventional approach to military problems, their willingness to challenge established norms, made them uncomfortable reminders of just how desperate the situation had been. The post-war Soviet Union had little place for heroes who didn't fit neatly into official narratives of the Great Patriotic War. The Night Witches were acknowledged, honored, and then quietly encouraged to return to more traditional roles. Many found themselves reassigned to civilian aviation, flying transport aircraft or working as flight instructors. Others left aviation entirely, returning to the academic, agricultural, or industrial careers they had abandoned to serve their country. The process of forgetting began almost immediately. Official histories focused on the great tank battles, the siege warfare, the heroic resistance of major cities. The Night Witches, when they were mentioned at all, were treated as an interesting footnote, a curiosity of wartime desperation, rather than a revolutionary development in military aviation. The very success of their psychological warfare worked against their historical recognition. Their enemies had been so demoralized by their attacks that German records of Night Witch operations were often incomplete or exaggerated, making it difficult for historians to assess their true impact. Yet the legend persisted, passed down through whispered stories and faded photographs. Veterans of the Eastern Front, both Soviet and German, carried memories of those ghostly biplanes that appeared without warning in the depths of night. Children and grandchildren heard tales of great-aunts and family friends who had flown against the fascist invaders. Though the details were often vague, and the official recognition minimal, it would take decades for the full story of the Night Witches to emerge from the shadows of official indifference. Gradually, as the Cold War ended and archives opened, historians began to piece together the complete record of their achievements. Surviving veterans, now elderly women with memories stretching back to the darkest days of the war, found themselves once again in the spotlight. Their stories finally being told to audiences hungry for authentic accounts of courage and sacrifice. The recognition, when it finally came, revealed the true magnitude of what these women had accomplished. They had not simply served their country in a time of desperate need. They had redefined the very concept of military service. They had proven that effectiveness in combat had nothing to do with gender, size, or conventional military background, and everything to do with intelligence, determination, and the willingness to adapt to impossible circumstances. Their legacy extends far beyond the specific tactical innovations they pioneered or the strategic impact they achieved on the Eastern Front. The Night Witches demonstrated that war, for all its technological sophistication and bureaucratic complexity, ultimately comes down to individual human beings making choices about how far they are willing to go in service of causes larger than themselves. They showed that unconventional solutions to military problems could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that the weapons of war were limited only by the imagination and courage of those who wielded them. Today, as military forces around the world continue to grapple with questions of integration, specialization, and the proper role of different groups in combat operations, the story of the Night Witches offers both inspiration and practical lessons. They proved that diversity of background and perspective could be a source of strength rather than weakness, that innovative tactics could emerge from necessity when conventional approaches failed, and that the human spirit could triumph over material disadvantages through a combination of skill, courage, and unbreakable determination. The women who flew those canvas and wood biplanes into the teeth of German opposition were products of their time and place, shaped by the specific circumstances of the Soviet Union's struggle for survival against Nazi invasion. Yet their example transcends those historical particulars, speaking to universal human qualities that remain as relevant today as they were in the darkness above the Eastern Front more than 8 decades ago. In the end, the Night Witches achieved something far more significant than military victory. Though their contribution to that victory was substantial, they expanded the definition of what was possible, proving that courage and competence could emerge from any background, that innovation could triumph over superior resources, and that the human capacity for adaptation and growth was limited only by the willingness to embrace new challenges and overcome old prejudices. Their legacy lives on not just in the history books that finally acknowledge their achievements, but in every person who refuses to accept that something cannot be done simply because it has never been done before. They showed that mockery could be transformed into respect, that disadvantages could become advantages, and that the most devastating weapons were often those that arrived without warning in the depths of the darkest night. The Night Witches had flown into history on wings of wood and canvas, carrying nothing but bombs, courage, and an unshakable belief that their cause was just. They had faced the most advanced military machine of their era with obsolete equipment and unconventional tactics, and they had not merely survived, they had prevailed. In doing so, they had written a chapter in the annals of human achievement that continues to inspire and instruct all those who dare to imagine that the impossible might, after all, be possible. Asterisk, as the last echoes of their aircraft engines fade into history. The story of the Night Witches endures as testament to the proposition that in the darkest hours, when conventional wisdom offers no hope and traditional solutions have failed, the most unlikely heroes can emerge to light the way forward. They had taken to the skies when no one believed they could fly, and they had returned to Earth, having changed forever our understanding of what it means to serve, to sacrifice, and to soar. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk.